right. The wonderful thing about Keystone Sessions is if you want to continue your conversation, you want to grab a bite to eat, you feel free to go over to the other side. There's tables and chairs over there. Otherwise, we're going to get started with the next session here. This one is one, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, Das, but this is one I've been chasing after for a while. The opportunity to sit down and talk to you. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I've been difficult to
No. And that's part of why I've been tracking you down is because I know you're difficult to get a hold of because you're busy. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. Now, I have a policy. I don't like to introduce people, so I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are. Tell us a little bit about what you, a little bit about your story, and then we'll get into some questions.
Sure. So my name's Das, and I like the open-ended way you laid it out, right? Tell us your story and tell us who you are. So that's I like how you framed that. So one of the where my mind goes is I'm an extremely lucky entrepreneur at this point. I didn't think I was going to be one. I thought I was going to work on new and exciting things at the edge of what's possible in technology. That was, if you will, how I would describe my 8-year-old self would describe what I wanted to do as an adult as invent new technology. It just so happens entrepreneurship is a vehicle to go do that. So I've been very fortunate to spend the last 10 years of my career and life in and around that, right? Actually longer than that, 15 years. But 10 years ago, did a venture around eye vein biometrics, where we invented the ability to match people's identities based on the layout of red blood vessels in the eye entirely in software in a cryptographically private way. And so that led to a wonderful journey, not just in Kansas City, but also in Asia with Alibaba. And then that led to a wonderful journey of discovering what the latest and greatest and the frontier of technology globally is. I lived in Tel Aviv for most of that time, and gave me it gave me a macro perspective of what's working and what's not working in the world, and what is the most impactful problem to go fix. And that led me to my next company, which is TripleBlind. And at TripleBlind, we're building a way to use the world's most valuable data in a way where regulations and compliance and ethical concerns are not a barrier. So what could you do if the entirety of the world's data was accessible to you?
So this is a personal passion of mine based on my experience with Pinsight Media, this whole how do you unlock the value of data? So I want to come back to that one as we get into this, because I believe you are tackling the greatest challenge in front of unlocking the value of true data monetization and data use, which is in many ways fear, right? Uncertainty of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt surrounding, my data is valuable, but I don't want to give it to anybody. So you are solving, I think, a huge problem there. But I want to go back. So you say this journey started, we'll say 15 years ago. So what originally brought you to Kansas City?
Yeah, actually, interestingly, the journey started well before 15 years. It just the last 15 years has felt like it was. There's this famous CEO that talks about the dots that make sense going backward, and it all makes sense. So the first book I ever read was 6 years old. I was 6 years old. The book was older. The book was called The C Programming Language by Kernighan and Ritchie, right?
It's 6.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I've been like a developer and a programmer and a want to be, a technology builder for pretty much as long as I have a memory, right? But again, a series of lucky events. I got my first computer, and my uncle was a professor here at the University of Missouri, Kansas City at UMKC. And, my mother said, hey, he can go down a path of playing games, or he can go down a more productive path of doing something else. And so because he had founded the computer science department here, he had a long background of telecom. He actually worked at AT&T Bell Labs. He was brought in here to start a computer networking department for obvious reasons. There's a big networking company in town that wanted to hire locally.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yes. And so he came in from Bell Labs over to UMKC, set up a networking department. Also the inspiration behind why I got that book as a 6-year-old kid. And then I grew up with a single mother with not very much. So when it was time for me to go to college, while I had got into other schools, for example, let's say you get into MIT, and I was an immigrant, even if you get a full ride, you still need to be able to show financial resources for the full 4 years of college to get a visa to the country, a student visa. So clearly that was infeasible. So I ended up in Kansas City, where obviously there was a lot of scholarship opportunity and what I felt like a very underrated computer science program. And that exposed me to the world of science and technology and computer science in a very real way, not just from an educational perspective, but also in a very applied perspective. What I mean by that was, of course, college took 4 years for me, and I was able to really discover and learn other things besides what I thought I set out to learn. An 18-year-old me set out to learn computer science, but 22-year-old me came out learning mathematics and entrepreneurship and computer science, of course, but also did a whole bunch of internships. I worked at several Bay Area companies, if you will, the top 3 internships at the time, 2008 to 2012, which gave me a very, very good perspective as to what excellent performance looks like.
So, so many of those things that you didn't know or didn't intend to go learn that you learned in that experience. Entrepreneurship sounds like that was one of them. So where was the intersection for you? So this isn't one of those like, as a kid I sold lemonade, as a kid I was an entrepreneur. This was one of those things, maybe you were going to be a programmer, you were going to be in computer science.
Yeah.
And where did you, I'll just use this phrase, where did you stumble upon the idea of entrepreneurship or the learning of entrepreneurship?
That's a great story. So I was not a natural entrepreneur. I was not that kid that you
hear that, folks. Right? It can be learned. Yes.
Absolutely. Yes, everything can be learned, which is foundational to my existence. So in 2007, Apple releases the iPhone. In 2008, my first year of college, they released the iPhone SDK. And the iPhone SDK, I thought, was foundational and fundamental to unlocking a wave of innovation. So what I do is, I buy a Mac and I'm one of the first few users of the iPhone SDK. And I start programming and I build an app that at the time takes off like wildfire. I was like, wow, this is extremely powerful. And it just so happened because it was one of the first 1,000 apps. And I just wrote it as a freshman in college in my free time, right? So that exposed me to the possibility that, you can create something, and that's a lot of fun, but to be able to have an impact at the scale that you really want, you want to be able to think broadly about how to take that technology to the world, right? It's not just about building. It's not just about building technology. It is about building the things around the technology as well. As you can tell, I think in a technology-centric way, still probably, but that's not sufficient. You can build the greatest product in the world. That doesn't mean the best users for that product are ever going to discover it, find it, pay for it, and find value in it. So that app was also interestingly, it was technically cool in that it was the first neural network application on the iPhone. It was a Chinese gambling game that nobody had ever heard of, but everybody in China had heard of. So the first users in China looked for that game and bought it, right? And it was like the time when, there were probably less than 2,000 apps for the first couple of years of the App Store. Obviously, there's way more than that now. So that started a journey of app development for me. And so my next couple of apps were market failures, technical successes. So we built an app for assistive technology to help kids with disabilities learn how to read and write, and develop speech. And I worked with my co-founder at the time was a linguist trained at the University of Hawaii. His entire life's work was around teaching people with disabilities how to read and write. And one accidental success and several failures taught me that there was something here that I needed to learn, right? And those gaps were not technical gaps. They were not gaps in how do you make a program run faster or at a higher scale or
this
something.
Was the downloads weren't there, the uptake wasn't there, and wait, but it works like it's supposed to, but there's something that's not happening.
That's correct. So the technology was solid, but there was, we got to about 40,000 downloads, which is insignificant, right? So then, of course, like every college student, I set out to solve a non-technical problem using technology, as my first, if you will, quote unquote venture, right? And it was at the same time that the university, the UMKC block school, the business school of the university, was advertising a 1-year program called e-scholars, entrepreneurship scholars.
Right.
So I get into that program, and then I start a venture around helping college kids find jobs while they were still in college. So it was a job market it was basically a two-sided platform, where on one side you had the supply of college students, and the other side you had demand for college labor.
So is this the first time, Doss, that you thought about it more in the full scope of like a business?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. The first time. I had never thought about user acquisition. I had never thought about a marketing plan. I had never thought about a coherent pricing model. Everything was stumbled upon. The venture clearly was not successful for obvious reasons. I didn't know how to do it. But it led me down a path of continuous learning and discovery. I consider, I think there's two differentiators for me as a person. I think one is my belief, and luckily so far it has been my ability to be able to learn almost anything. And I'm a fairly good independent learner. So while I learn from a lot of people, I can often be pointed at a particular direction and then figure out the details.
So we always talk about learning styles, like just as I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but everybody has like a different learning style. So do you have a specific learning style? Like, so is it the consumption of written content? Is it visual? Like
written content.
Written
it's
content.
Actually so
voracious reader.
Voracious, of course. I have 7,000 books on my Kindle right now on my pocket, and about 5,000.
I have 7. Yeah. Okay.
And what's funny is my wife and I will watch a movie, and I will not understand it until I read the plot summary on Wikipedia. So it's that bad. So absolutely written content all the way. I'm gonna. I have a book arriving in the mail about genomic analysis because some of the work we're doing is in genetics, and so anyway, that's how I learn. And so as long as there's a book in English, I can probably figure it out. It's kind of how I operate.
Okay.
And the second thing is an ability to just work really hard. My co-founder, and I've been very, 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 very lucky to have always had very strong mentors lift me up. So anywhere I've gotten is because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. One of them is my co-founder at TripleBlind. His name's Greg Storm, and he was one of the original people behind Accenture, and obviously Accenture is a very success story in consulting. And in 2016, right after iVerify sold to Alibaba, we went to China, and we were just generally chatting. He had worked with me at that time, and we were chatting, and I asked him, Greg, what's the secret to a successful life, right? And he said, be moderately smart and work like a dog, right? So if those are the only two things required,
those boxes.
I think I can do those two.
Yeah. So I've heard varying versions of this, so I want to ask the source for the right one. The iVerify story, like the IP side of that, the invention side of what became iVerify. Tell me a little bit about like where that started and like how that became a company.
Yeah, so iVerify was a really great Kansas City story, right? So Dr. Reza Darkhshani, who was my master's advisor, had been doing a lot of research around how do you use computer vision and image processing and artificial intelligence to identify people. And he had a background in general biometrics, right? Fingerprints and face and all of that. He was a subject matter expert in that. That was a topic of his PhD. But at the time, a couple of things. Right? This is in late 2000s timeframe, if you will. This is for any AI. I think the last presentation here was about AI, and one of the foundational moments of AI is the AlexNet moment, right? Where the AlexNet moment was in 2012 a particular neural network architecture that led to very promising results, right? So this is pre-AlexNet, when people were bearish on AI. The word AI was thought to be something that would never deliver,
right?
Kind of like quantum computers are thought of as today, right?
Right.
So in that, and the tooling wasn't there, right? Today, if you wanted to get into AI, you have Google, how to train an AI network, and within 5 minutes you're off into the races. At that time, you had to code your own network from scratch, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have now at the university is a grant where we were buying computers and cameras, just like that one. Of course, DSLRs from 2007-8 timeframe. And we were taking pictures of the eyes with the idea that it was going to, that the eye veins were going to be unique.
Mhm.
And of course, we had read literature that said that, that is really unique.
More unique than a fingerprint.
And the beauty of it is that it is not a genetic feature, meaning even among twins and triplets and closely related siblings, it is unique in that the eyes are a very stable feature. Your eyes are about the same size throughout the course of your life. They don't grow in any meaningful way. Your hands grow. Your hands change. Your hands may,
And your vein footprint doesn't
and your
change.
vein footprint does not change.
That is
So
amazing.
that is largely formed in as you were a baby and a kid, and so it's a very stable biometric. So unless and the common question you ask, and most people ask, is, what happens if I get injured? It just becomes more prominent. It actually is helpful from a biometric perspective, right? If your veins are more visible in the visible light spectrum, it is easier to identify. So the beauty of this is now they're unique. Again, I'm talking about the technology a little bit. The problem is, if you use AI to identify people, you need to be able to, you lack the ability to be able to explain why you identified them. So let's just say an AI algorithm looks at your eyes and decides it's the same. You can't prove why it decided to do that. You can't prove that it's a correct match or a false match. And based on that, it is extremely difficult to rely on that as a basis for, say, a banking regulation around know your customer, or a banking regulation around money laundering, or etc. If it's your simple phone unlock use case, that's a totally different use case than where legal ramifications of that identification are involved. So what was unique about the approach at iVerify was that we built an explainable system entirely in software to be able to identify you in a way that also never impacted your privacy. What I mean by that is, we are all familiar with password authentication, right? And the problem with passwords is that they get hacked. And any piece of information that ever exists on any computer, you operate on the assumption that it will sometime in the future be compromised.
It's going to get out there. Yeah.
Yes. So the problem with biometrics is, if you ever work with biometrics in a way that you store images, you can't, and you assume that it is going to be compromised despite your best attempts. At that point, you have lost, unlike a password, your identity in a way that you cannot change. You can't change your eyes just because it's been compromised, right? So what we built was also the notion of effectively what's called one-way encryption. So that's a neat, interesting idea, right? What is one-way encryption? Why is it different than regular encryption? So let me go down that rabbit hole for about a minute. So the history of encryption is where Julius Caesar employed it for the first time to send messages across enemy territory, right? And what he did was he would put his messages somewhere, and the analogy is he would lock it, or the equivalent of that is a Caesar cipher where you shift the letters, and then you would send it, and if the enemy found it, they wouldn't be able to decipher it, but if the other person, the general on the other side, read it, they would be able to decrypt and decipher what the message was, right? But something had changed in the world, which is that human judgment was no longer the only way to provide judgment. In that biometric scheme that I described, a human being was never going to look at it and decide if it were the same person. So you never needed to preserve the attributes in a way that was going to be human readable. So we effectively invented a one-way encryption technique where the data could be encrypted in a way that it could never be decrypted. Literally never, mathematically provably. So the value proposition is, if your phone or whatever device the technology was being used on ever got compromised, none of that could ever lead to your eye veins being reconstructed or your image being leaked. And we've got, not even with quantum computers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very strong guarantee. I went into that description of one-way encryption is because iVerify employed it in the narrow scope of iVein biometrics. TripleBlind has extended upon it to do it for any type of data and any type of algorithm.
I was just about to ask you, is the value of what you created with iVerify, it now that I understand what you've just described, is it less about the specific biometric footprint that you chose to use for iVerify, or more about the one-way encryption
Of course, yeah.
that you created?
And so now we've got over 70 patents around it, with this collective body of work, which is how do you encrypt things in a way that it cannot be decrypted ever, it cannot be abused ever, and it cannot be used for anything other than the purpose it was intended for without ever seeing it.
So explain how that works in Triple.
Yeah.
Like, so what's the problem that you're solving with TripleBlind?
Yeah, the problem is, if you think about, this is December of 2022, right? We just read about ChatGPT and all these amazing discoveries that we've had in the world of AI. None of that has impacted healthcare, financial services, or the most regulated industries. We have the underlying technology that can enable us to make foundational improvements in how we diagnose disease, how we treat them, and how we learn about whether or not they're effective. The treatments were effective.
Because the data
the data is locked behind, for good reason, silos, HIPAA silos in the United States, CPPA silos in Canada, GDPR silos in Europe, data residency silos in Saudi Arabia, in Israel, in Indian privacy law, in Chinese privacy law. So the data is there, it's just not able to be used. If you show up to a random hospital, let's just say in Beijing, and you say, "Hi, Kevin, would like to access your data, and I have good intentions," I
don't think that's going to go well. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And so the state-of-the-art way, for example, for a very promising researcher that has a hypothesis they want to be testing or a treatment they're developing for, let's just pick a real-life example, atrial fibrillation, a disease condition of the heart where it's irregular, right? It requires you to be able to examine EKGs and identify whether or not there's irregularity in the beating of your heart. It is clearly a problem an AI network could do really, really well, right? But the problem is all of those EKGs are at hospitals. And again, to my point earlier, if you just show up at a hospital and say, "Give me all your EKGs," they can be like, "No, I can't do it for you because, of course, it's protected by HIPAA, and I have no way to de-identify it. Even if I wanted to share it with you, I can't de-identify it."
And the value of that is if you had all of that data and then you had all of population health data around, you could start to draw correlations to what might be causing these things or how you might be able to treat these things.
Even more basic is the presence of disease. Is this a sick person or not? You're
Right.
building a diagnostic algorithm to look at an EKG and identify if a EKG shows sickness, right? Today, we know that the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation really depends on the skill and training of the doctor. So if you're at the Mayo Clinic, that doctor's diagnosis of atrial fibrillation is likely 2 to 3 years ahead of somebody that's not that caliber and that training.
Gotcha.
So an AI algorithm can be trained to detect micro patterns in your EKG to identify atrial fibrillation 10 years before the best cardiologists in the world. That's problem number one. Okay. How do you detect diseases sooner so that you can do preventative care as opposed to treatment for the disease?
And without access to the data, it's not possible.
It's not possible. Then you have the problem of licensing those algorithms. So now you go to the FDA and you say, "I can diagnose atrial fibrillation or any disease that I'm studying faster, better, more accurately, cheaper than any other competing method," right? An AI algorithm is, or an inference from an AI algorithm is significantly cheaper than going to a cardiologist.
Yeah.
Now, again, the problem is when you're deploying it at the, say, community health center, that person, that center cannot just be sending data off to whoever wrote the algorithm, right? They're not going to say, "Kevin just walked in here. I just took his EKG. You should take a look at his EKG, Mr. Algorithm Provider." Right? And you're not going to give your algorithm to them because you're like, "It's my IP." Right? So at that point, TripleBlind also invented the concept of encrypting your algorithm. Again, a lot of encryption going on here.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you encrypt your data in a one-way way, where the EKG will never be able to be used to identify Kevin, will never be used to identify your gender or any other disease except for atrial fibrillation, and you have the algorithm also encrypted in a way that whoever's licensing the algorithm mathematically cannot reverse engineer it, now you can deploy your algorithm to a worldwide audience and not have to worry about the data privacy laws that your algorithm's potentially seeing PHI. actual data.
Yeah.
So you unlock several orders of magnitude of innovation in healthcare that has been pent up for the last 15 years because of an inability to get to the data.
And to your point, this isn't just applicable in healthcare; it's applicable in finance and
Absolutely,
yes, in fintech.
Yes,
absolutely.
we, as of right now, I believe we're in healthcare and financial services as a company. I believe the impact in those two sectors is tremendous. Are there applications in other sectors? Absolutely, yes. Anywhere where data is locked behind regulatory or compliance or privacy or ethical concerns, TripleBlind is potentially a solution.
Right.
But again, from an early stage startup perspective, you have to choose a focus area. And I get personally very excited about the opportunity and the potential in healthcare.
Yeah, it's a big. Yeah, you tackled the big one though up front, right? There probably could have been easier use cases.
Yeah, I think so. I think there. Let me take a detour. Right, there are easier use cases, but one of the lessons learned from iVerify for all of us was the company only ever grows as big as your vision. So I just described to you the intricacies of a biometric verification system, but the impact of that was okay. But the biggest impact came after Alibaba bought us, and Jack's vision for the technology was to empower the 2 billion underbanked people in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia to be able to use financial services in a way that provided what he called financial inclusion. Why didn't we think of financial inclusion if that was where the value is, right?
Right.
So we were guilty of not casting the biggest vision and going after the biggest, most ambitious, most audacious goal.
I think that's a huge point, Das, is that your company's only as big as the vision that you've cast for it. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people think that
yeah,
way.
but I didn't want to repeat that mistake.
Yeah, that's fair. So let's talk about the transition. So you, what year did you guys exit, or what year did the sale to Alibaba occur? It was Ant Financial, right?
Ant Financial and Alibaba are sister companies, yes.
Yeah, so 2016.
2016, yeah.
And then you stayed on with the new company for, what was the earn
until 2019, yes.
2019, okay.
So it was I'm a programmer. As you can tell, I've been, I get conflicting advice, and sometimes I have to filter the signal from the noise. Sometimes they say yes to everything. Other people say you're not saying no enough. But I probably operate more in a say yes to everything mode. So what I said yes to was an opportunity to go lead Alibaba Ventures.
Okay.
Right? And it was an incredible journey because Alibaba at the time, well, still to this day, is one of the largest companies in the world. And Ant was the fastest growing company ever in the history of mankind. And what they identified was 5 key technology areas where they wanted to stay ahead of innovation using, of course, internal R&D, but also corporate investments. So those 5 areas were blockchain, AI, security, IoT, and cloud computing. If you think about it, it's an all-encompassing acronym called BASIC for all of the foundational technologies on top of which the technology for the next 100 years is going to be built.
Yeah, for sure.
And so leading that wave of Alibaba's investments, especially out of Tel Aviv, gave me a very unique perspective into the market that I was able to exploit at TripleBlind.
So I want to put a pin in that, but I want to talk about Tel Aviv for a second. So the guiding principle behind what we're doing with Keystone, the idea that placemaking matters in innovation, all stems from some research that was done at MIT by a group, Fiona Murray and Phil Budin, who run a lot of the innovation work at MIT. And Thomas Friedman had written a book called The World is Flat, talks about the democratization of commerce and workforce based on access to computers, access to networks, those types of things. But the folks at MIT said, all right, that's fine. Like, there could be democratization of all these things, but innovation still keeps happening in places. And so what is it about those places? And they did the research around what needs to be in the place, what kind of programming needs to be there, and those types of things. And the one example that they brought up that like sparked the research was what happens in Tel Aviv. Now, I've been a big fan of what, the Startup Nation and all of the work that's happened there. What did you observe in your time in Tel Aviv that you would say sets it apart for folks that haven't read or haven't studied, like what is it about Tel Aviv that it is an innovation center on the planet?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I have two different answers, right? One from the historical perspective and one from the philosophical perspective. So let's go down the historical perspective first, right? So there was no innovation in Israel until about the early 90s, in 93, 94-ish. There's a guy, Yossi Vardi, who sells ICQ to AOL. And it's a $400-ish million exit. And it electrifies the country, right? The ideas. Wow. What is the internet? What is instant messaging?
Right,
and why does an American company pay $400 million for it?
Right.
And Yossi, which is the English name for Yossi is Joseph, Yossi Vardi, really became a champion for Israeli technology worldwide. He started a venture fund. He started inspiring the next generation of entrepreneurs to go build ventures as opposed to work at tech companies. So that's one inflection point, is Yossi Vardi and his personal leadership and faith and influence on an entire generation of builders in Israel. There's a second trend, which is that of Unit 8200. So I don't know if, for those unfamiliar, every 18-year-old in Israel, every 18-year-old goes to the military.
Male or female?
Both, correct. And 1% of those 18-year-olds go to a unit in the military called 8200. So 8200 is the Israeli NSA. And they are trained for 4-ish years, depending on gender, to be the most battle-hardened warfighters in the cyber realm. So 8200, and then there's 81 and Talpiot and a few other different programs that train 1% of the 18-year-olds every year to be cyber offensive and defensive operators. And so the program started a few decades ago, and for a while, the graduates of that program were going to Intel and Microsoft and larger companies, Yahoo. And what Yossi Vardi did was inspired, when I say inspired an entire generation, for the vast majority of years after Yossi Vardi's exit to AOL, all of those 18-year-olds decided, if Yossi can do it, why can't I?
They stopped leaving. The
Exactly.
brain drain stopped.
And Intel had set up an R&D center in Israel, which was sort of the first one. They didn't even need to leave Israel. They no longer worked at large companies. They built their own ventures. It was like, if Yossi can do it, I can do it. And that leads me to my second point about the philosophy, which is an attitude of chutzpah. And chutzpah, CHUTZPAH, is sort of an excessive amount of self-belief, right? Which also dovetails into my point earlier about the initiative you're working on is only ever going to be as grand or as big as the vision you cast for it. So Israeli entrepreneurs are not guilty of casting a small vision.
Right.
They go after the world market from a small country that's smaller than the size of New Jersey, right? Israel has very interesting demographics. 9 million people, about a third of the people don't work because they're the super observant Jews. And it's only about the tech ecosystem is only about 250,000. And yet, in my years there, what I observed was over 7,000 companies that had done a Series A and above. Over 1,000 venture funds.
That's insane.
Investing in that ecosystem. And they were selling to a global market. You build in Israel, and then you sell in China, or Germany, or the United States.
I always try to tell people, like, between what happens in Tel Aviv, what happens in Israel, and what happens in Ireland, the innovation per capita, if you will, is like, I don't think if people really understood, it would blow people's mind. And so to think about what's possible here, if we really were apply. So let me go down that rabbit hole for a second with you. So what started there and what materialized there, what is transferable to a place like Kansas City? Like, what things can we learn from what has happened there that could help us? More resources in a way, people, some of the things that we have. What are we missing, or what's transferable knowledge?
That's a good question. I've pondered that quite a bit. I think one of the big misses in this town that we can learn from from the Israeli miracle is the fact that innovation is possible anywhere, especially here, right? TripleBlind is not a typical Kansas City company. iVerify was also not a typical Kansas City company. We build at the edge of what's possible in technology, right? And we have we still call ourselves a Kansas City company. A substantial portion of the companies in Kansas City, but there's quite a few of us now everywhere, all over the world, actually. But the fact that anything can be done here, and that the belief and the drive to go make it happen, I think is one big learning. If it can happen in Silicon Valley, if it can happen in New York, if it can happen in London or Beijing or Singapore, it can happen here.
Does it go back to your second philosophical principle, though?
Of chutzpah, yes. Yes, we were lacking in chutzpah, right? The second thing is I think we should, and I don't know the answer to this one, but I think we should do a better job of keeping the talent that we grow here in here. So I think that, as I said earlier in my preamble, UMKC is an underrated program, right? Sure. And so first, let me just, again, I think statistically in a lot of ways. 2008 fall, when I started college, 296 students in computer science. Do you want to take a guess at how many graduated 4 years later, computer science?
Not really.
2.
Oof.
Out of 296, 2.
Yeah.
Right?
Oof.
And I don't want to say the other people didn't graduate. They just didn't graduate with computer science. So they went to psychology or mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, or not electrical engineering, but other disciplines, right? And I think there was a belief
begs the question, why?
Well, I have my theories, but they're unproven, right?
Sure.
One theory is I think I saw a lot of people that they were like, I built computers, I'm pretty good at assembling a computer, but didn't underestimated the math and physics and science needs.
Sure.
But I don't have any proven theories here, or nor do I have any evidence here. But I have that statistic, right? Which is an alarming statistic. But that's not the only university. Of course, there were 2, and you know both of them. You happen to know both of them. But one is me, the other one's Ravi. But KU, K-State, Mizzou, MSD, etc., are training very good students that choose to no longer build their careers here. They're going.
So here's something I learned in Atlanta, Das, real quick, is when I was down there at Technology Square in 2018, kind of scoping out what was possible from an innovation district perspective in a city like Kansas City. We are, of our 30 peer cities, the ones 15 above us in population, 15 below us in population, we are one of 2 cities in that list that don't have an R1, which is the highest designation of research university, Carnegie rankings. We're one of only 2 cities that doesn't have an R1 university in the metro. But we are in rare air because we're one of only 3 cities in the United States that has 6 R1 universities that are within a 250-mile radius of the metropolitan core. And all of those college towns, Manhattan, Lawrence, Columbia, Iowa State, Lincoln, Nebraska, even Fayetteville at the time, they all consider Kansas City their urban core, right? Kansas City is the closest urban center to most of those, of any scale. And this is where people would take their summer vacations. If you grew up in Omaha, you would come to Kansas City, you go to Royals game, you go to Worlds of Fun, you do those kinds of things. So we have these assets that we don't unlock when you talk about the universities and the ability for us to attract talent or the ability for us to retain talent. We lose all those students too, because all of those programs take their top students to Silicon Valley for a trip or to Boston for a trip. There's not a reason, who's the hometown team that they would play for? So we're all cheering for you to create that hometown team that they all want to play for with TripleBlind.
Yeah, I think clearly I'm not a very flashy, out in the public kind of person, right? But I think the startup community here could do a better job connecting with those universities. I consider myself guilty of not engaging enough with the university. I mean, I'm not trying to build an excuse here, but building a startup is a lot of work, right? And if there was a thing like Keystone, where organic collisions could happen between the startup community and the university community, especially the STEM community at the university, at the college level,
right?
I feel like we develop a much better probability of keeping that talent, right? The That's the best one I can think of right now. Now, especially in a post-COVID world,
Mhm.
I think people are hungry for socialization. They're hungry for face-to-face meetings, um, and I think that's democratizing talent. This is a hypothesis. I don't have any evidence, but we used to. The average cost of an employee in Kansas City is a lot lower than the average cost of an employee in San
Facts.
Francisco, and we used to,
And we know that.
and now it's
Yes.
no longer the case, right? Because as a result of COVID, that advantage is gone.
At a per company level, but not at a geographic level, though, right?
No, I think the same people that would have worked, say, for X dollars now can work remotely
Right. Can live here
and live here for 2X, right? And so that advantage, if you will, from a company building perspective, is gone. And so now there's no difference between hiring in San Francisco and Kansas City, arguably, because people are asking and getting the same market rate everywhere. What is missing is that if you do work for a San Francisco-based company and you do make 2X, you probably aren't seeing your colleagues and you probably don't have a sense of community.
Right.
So the tech community in Kansas City has an opportunity and a value proposition to the tech worker here, whether they work at a local company or a remote company, to build a sense of community that may potentially help them consider their next role potentially being in a local company.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So I want to shift gears a little bit. So I want to talk about scaling. So you're one of you're in unfortunately rare air in Kansas City that you're one of the few entrepreneurs that was behind a $100 million plus exit in Kansas City, and so I think you have a important perspective on what it takes to scale, what it takes to get to kind of the finish line, if you will, on that. It is interesting to me, and this is one of the reasons I like to start with, like, tell us about yourself, because, like, what's your perception of yourself and how would you introduce yourself? And to hear you talk about yourself as kind of a technologist, which you are clearly, but that you had to learn entrepreneurship, or you kind of stumbled into the entrepreneurship journey. What have you learned about through that journey of actually building a company and building a company to scale? What have you learned about scaling a venture that you don't think they teach in the university? Right? Because we teach things like product market fit.
Yeah.
We teach the elements of starting a venture. The scaling a venture is a very different thing, and it's a very different beast.
It's a very good question. I don't have a canned answer, so I'm going to be thinking on my feet here.
I think you're pretty good at that. I think we're okay.
So I think it's shifting. COVID has caused a lot of changes.
Okay.
So the way you scale the company in 2019 and prior is not how you scale a company anymore.
You think it's fundamentally that different?
I think it's fundamentally that different.
Okay.
So, for example, I know how to build a 250-person company in Kansas City pre-2019. I don't think I know that anymore. So today, if I had to do that, I would probably go remote first. I would probably put a different set of focus areas on culture. Culture is not organically as easy to build in a remote first company.
A stronger emphasis on culture today versus 2019.
That's correct, because
it doesn't
in
happen
2019
organically.
it was happening via osmosis. The culture is not built via osmosis on Teams or Zoom or whatever
for sure.
your tool is, right? So one thing I've learned overall is a process that you have to adapt. Adaptability to the environment before your competitors and ahead of the market is probably your most important skill as an entrepreneur. So to keep your nose to the ground and make sure you're ahead of the game there. I think one. So I can ramble on a couple of things. On the engineering side, what I learned about scaling is quality talent is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Opportunity is not universally distributed, but talent is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and at the same time, the ways you screen for talent at this 10-ish employee level versus the 50-ish employee level is very different. And in that, I use this analogy of mercenaries versus missionaries, right? And I believe that up until about the 100-ish people mark, you ought to try really, really hard to find the missionaries. Somebody that's excited by the mission, is not here for the paycheck, is not here for the equity value, for example, but is genuinely here to make the impact that the company has chosen to start to make, right? Because you're going to be demanding a lot in unpredictable ways of those first 100 people. There's going to be changes in direction, changes in tactics, and potentially changes in strategy, even in a short enough time frame where you're trying to iterate and try to find either product market fit or channel growth fit, etc., where you are hopefully aligning your team, of course, very well financially, right? One of my operating principles is everybody in the company has equity and a substantial amount of equity in the company. So hopefully you're aligning that way, but also on top of that, hopefully you are hiring the missionaries that will be with you, throughout the way. I think on the go-to-market side, the first going 0 to 1 on the go-to-market side has always been a more challenging problem for me. I can go 0 to 1 on the product side far more easier than the go-to-market side, right? So, but I still think 0 to 1 is founder-led. And then 1 to N is where, if you're a founder like me, you need very, very strong leadership early on that you can trust and rely on, that knows the subject matter of selling. Selling is a skill. And managing a sales process, especially a large enterprise sales process where the deal size is a couple $1 million, is its own craft.
Oh yeah.
And that's when you want to get somebody that's not just an individual contributor, but also able to develop in a company, let's say, that's potentially where someone like me is involved. You want to build that sales culture early on, as opposed to letting a few years go and then trying to build or infuse a sales culture.
Because you've become
too much of a product company.
Too much of a product or too much of a technology company. Correct. And you don't have that that ability, that DNA. That's
correct, exactly. Infusing the sales DNA in a product-led company and infusing a product DNA.
Doing it early.
Doing it early is one of the fundamental learnings that I've had.
The remote dev team situation, does that change who you look at for dev manager? Like the skill sets that you look for your dev managers or for your the leaders of the company as well? The ability to, do we talk about, like when you talk about culture, the emphasis on culture needing to be stronger.
Yeah.
How?
Yes. So, for example, you lose the advantage of learning by osmosis. So you have to document more.
Okay.
So you have to send more written communication, in my opinion. You want to be able to operate asynchronously because you're on different time zones. So getting everybody on a call or getting everybody in a room is impractical, not unscalable, and does not lead to any tribal knowledge. So you document it.
And it creates a retention problem because there's people that don't like getting up at 6 a.m. for the 8 a.m. meeting in Kansas City. Yeah.
So you just heard me talk about encryption, yada, yada, yada. So one of the limitations, of course, given the fact that we work in encryption, we have, which has sort of served us, at the time we didn't like it, but it served us well, is that we can only recruit and work with U.S. citizens.
Right.
For obvious cryptographic reasons.
Right.
And so we have employees all over the world on the go-to-market side, but our core dev team is all within the United States. And so clusters have emerged. And so one of the things we've done with great effect is quarterly on-sites. Once a quarter, everybody comes into town, and you get 1 day of programming and 2 days of team building. And that has been tremendous for us. We have about 55 people fly into town, and it has started to build a culture of transparency, openness, and trust.
Yeah, I was going to ask trust. That's one of the biggest things, and I think people underemphasize the importance of things like team building. They think it's an unnecessary, like a boondoggle or like we don't need to have those types of things. But if I can sit across from you and we can have drinks, or we can sit there and I get to know you.
Yeah.
Like the opportunity for me to work with you is much different.
Absolutely. And now that I know this place exists, we could host an on-site here, for example, right? I just didn't know we had it. I mean, we're running out of office space where we're at in the plaza.
Breaking news, people. Breaking news.
Yeah.
So, all right. So scaling is different I mean, sure. Scaling is different post-pandemic than pre-pandemic. What elements of scaling do you think aren't different? Like fundamentals that haven't changed based on.
I think I often hear people describe a Kansas City company or a Midwestern company. And I think that does the company injustice. If you're not playing at the global scale, and you're not a global company from day one, what are you doing? Why? Why would you go after a smaller market? Why would you say I only want to sell bad pants or bad shoes, right? Or low quality pants or low quality shoes. For example, iVerify went to market globally from day one. Our first set of customers were phone manufacturers in China. Then it was global banks. Then it was a payment wallet in China, which ultimately ended up acquiring us. And
do you think if you weren't involved in the company, that would have been the case?
I don't want to speculate on what ifs.
That's fair.
But potentially, yeah.
Okay.
I think it's important that you start with a global market from day one. You have to be building a globally, you have to be number one. Otherwise, in this hyper-connected world, you just lose your advantage to the next mover who's able to move quickly. Just look at, any category-defining company. You want to be building category-defining companies, and the way to build a category-defining company is to be global and go after a global market. It actually is easier to go global today than it was in 2012.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of the way we work with I was on a plane to, I think I've taken, I think there was a year where I flew 2 million miles in 1 year, 2 million miles. I think I got exposed to more radiation than is federally allowed for flight attendants.
Did the pilot come back and give you one of those little metal cards?
They did that after the pandemic. When I first flew in 2021 after not flying, the Delta pilot came in and was like, "Wow, we missed you." And I was like, "Oh my God."
All right. The most depressing movie, if you haven't seen it, is George Clooney, Up in the Air. I think it's, and that is like every time it comes on, I have to watch the rest of it, and then I cry at the end of it. I'm like, that was me.
All of my Thanksgivings and Christmases were at United lounges or Delta lounges, and I was like, hopefully I make it home by dinner.
Don't let that happen anymore.
Yeah.
Man. No. All right. So we're running out of time. I literally could probably sit here and talk to you for a long time, hours on end about kind of your experience and so on. So I'm going to make the offer or the ask that I usually do. Will you come back?
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
And then where do you so what advice? So the last question I'll ask is all right, so you've got eScholars, you've got all these universities that we've talked about around. You've got, or you've got, come on, the middle-aged man or woman who has a lived experience work problem that they're trying to solve, and they're going to start a new venture. So it doesn't matter age, I guess. I shouldn't pin this on college kids. What advice would you give someone who is chasing a big problem and is starting a new venture? What is this is Das's number one piece of advice that I would give to a first-time entrepreneur that's starting a high-growth, enterprise-based technology company?
Advice. I'm very good at receiving advice. I'm not very good at giving advice. I think
that should not be underemphasized. The fact that you have your emphasis on mentors, your emphasis on taking advice, I think that's part of what's made you so.
Oh, absolutely.
Part of what's made you so successful.
I'm very good at receiving advice.
So
but here's what I can think of. I think anything valuable is not worth doing without going all in. And the existence of a plan B means you have not gone all
in. Don't have a plan B. All in on plan A. Yeah.
Go all in on plan A. The existence of a plan B. The existence of a plan B implies that you've not gone all in.
All right. That's something for us all to ponder. Das, thanks, man.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate, and I say this to all of our Kansas City founders. I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing here in Kansas City. It's important. I'm glad that you're committed to community and that you're committed to what we're doing here in Kansas City. It means a lot to all of us. So if it isn't explicitly stated to you, let it be stated to you now. Thank you
so much. Thanks for having me, and thank you for building this. I saw it when it was a vision back in 2018, 2017 maybe? 2017, I think, when you were presenting and you were articulating your vision for what you were building. And it takes guts to go deliver on this. So congratulations. And
I got no plan B, man. I got no plan B.
Right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.